Today, I'm going to tell you about one of the most intense and emotionally challenging operations I ever participated. A civilian evacuation mission that became a race against time in a city under siege. Don't leave this video because I'm going to tell you every detail of this operation that tested not just our tactical skills, but our humanity itself. Every day on this channel, we bring you a new real story of military operations lived by me. My name is Steve Harris, former Sergeant Major, United States Army, and I served for 25 years in different operations around the world before retiring. What I'm about to share with you happened during one of the most challenging periods of my career, when we received an order that seemed almost impossible to execute. But let me tell you something. In the military, impossible is just another word for Tuesday. Before we dive deep into this story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel to be notified of new military stories, and leave a comment below. Also, don't forget that all the products I use and recommend are in the video description or pinned in the first comment. It was late August in the Middle East, the kind of heat that hits you like a physical wall when you step outside. I had just returned from a 3-week reconnaissance mission when Colonel Martinez called me into his office at 0600 hours. The urgency in his voice over the radio told me this wasn't going to be a routine briefing. When I walked into that air-conditioned command center, the relief from the oppressive heat was momentary. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The situation was critical, more critical than anything I had encountered in my 2.5 decades of service. A strategic city in the mountainous region had been under siege for 3 weeks straight. The enemy had systematically isolated the urban area, cutting off all supply routes, communication lines, and escape corridors. Intelligence reports indicated that between 400 and 600 civilians were trapped inside with rapidly dwindling supplies and absolutely no safe way out. But here's what made this situation particularly devastating, and you'll understand why this detail becomes crucial later in our story. These weren't random civilians caught in crossfire. This city had been specifically targeted because it housed families of government officials, international aid workers, and local community leaders who had been working to establish peace in the region. The enemy knew exactly who they had trapped, and they were using these innocent people as bargaining chips in a much larger political game. The briefing room was packed with personnel from multiple nations. This wasn't going to be a unilateral American operation. We had representatives from British Special Air Service, Spanish Special Forces, Danish military advisors, and Canadian reconnaissance specialists. The overhead projector displayed satellite images of the besieged city that made my stomach turn. It looked like something from World War II, a maze of narrow medieval streets now blocked with rubble, collapsed buildings creating choke points, and strategic positions that made any military operation a logistical nightmare. Colonel Martinez stood at the front of the room, his usually steady voice carrying an edge I had rarely heard. "Gentlemen," he began, "what you're looking at is Operation Last Chance. We have exactly 48 hours to extract as many civilians as possible before a major offensive levels the entire area. The political situation has deteriorated to the point where diplomatic solutions are no longer viable. We are literally the last hope for hundreds of innocent people." I remember looking around that room at the faces of operators who had seen everything the modern battlefield could throw at them. These were men who had operated in Afghanistan's mountains, Iraq's urban environments, and countless other hostile territories around the globe. But the expressions I saw weren't confidence or determination. They were the faces of professionals who understood exactly how challenging this mission was going to be. Let me introduce you to the team that would become my brothers over the next 48 hours. Sergeant Thompson, from the British SAS, a man whose calm demeanor under fire had saved countless lives in previous operations. I had worked with Thompson in 3 different theaters, and his ability to maintain tactical precision while under extreme stress was legendary among special operations communities. He had a way of reading enemy movement patterns that bordered on supernatural. Corporal Rodriguez, from the Spanish Special Forces, was our demolitions and terrain specialist. This man could look at a city block and tell you not just where the structural weak points were, but how to use the urban environment to your tactical advantage. Rodriguez had grown up in the mountains of northern Spain, and his understanding of how geography affects combat operations was absolutely crucial for this type of mission. Lieutenant Hansen from the Danish military served as our communications specialist, but that title didn't do justice to his capabilities. Hansen could establish and maintain contact with command elements, even in environments with heavy electronic interference. More importantly, he spoke 4 languages fluently and could serve as our primary interface with civilian populations who might not understand English commands during high-stress evacuation procedures. Master Sergeant Williams was my right-hand man, a soldier I had served with for over a decade in multiple combat zones. Williams had an intuitive understanding of tactical situations that couldn't be taught in any military school. He could assess threats, identify opportunities, and adapt operational plans in real time better than anyone I had ever served with. When Williams got that particular look in his eyes, you knew you were about to face something that would test every skill you had ever learned. The colonel's voice cut through my mental assessment of the team. "The situation on the ground is deteriorating rapidly," he continued, clicking to the next satellite image. "Our intelligence sources inside the city went dark 48 hours ago. The last communication we received indicated that civilians have gathered in 3 primary locations: a school complex on the eastern side, a hospital facility in the city center, and a residential compound on the western perimeter. Ooh, but here's what made this mission exponentially more dangerous. And this is a detail that will become absolutely critical as our story unfolds. The enemy had been systematically using these civilian gathering points as bait. They knew we would eventually attempt a rescue operation, and they had positioned their defensive assets specifically to turn any evacuation attempt into a killing field. We weren't just going into a rescue mission. We were walking into a carefully prepared trap. The tactical challenges were staggering. The city's infrastructure had been methodically targeted over the 3-week siege. Water treatment facilities, electrical power stations, communication towers, fuel depots. Everything that makes modern urban life possible had been destroyed. We would be operating in an environment that had essentially been reduced to medieval siege conditions, but with modern weapon systems and electronic surveillance technology working against us. The enemy had established a sophisticated perimeter defense with overlapping fields of fire, redundant communication networks, and mobile patrol elements that could respond rapidly to any breach attempt. Intelligence indicated they had surface-to-air missile capabilities, which severely limited our helicopter support options. Most of our movement would have to be on foot, through terrain that the enemy had been studying and preparing for weeks. As we examined detailed maps and aerial reconnaissance photographs, the scope of the logistical nightmare became clear. How do you coordinate the movement of hundreds of terrified civilians through hostile urban terrain without being detected? How do you communicate with people who might not speak your language and are probably traumatized by weeks of siege conditions? How do you make life or death decisions about evacuation priorities when every minute counts and you can't possibly save everyone simultaneously? The insertion plan was complex by necessity. We would use a combination of ground infiltration and extremely limited helicopter support. The helicopter assets would be restricted to emergency medical evacuation and final extraction phases only, due to the confirmed presence of shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles in the enemy defensive network. Primary insertion would be via ground vehicle to a position approximately 5 miles from the city perimeter, followed by foot movement using natural terrain features for concealment. Master Sergeant Williams pulled me aside after the main briefing concluded. He had that expression I had learned to recognize over our years of service together. The look that said we were about to face something that would push every one of our capabilities to the absolute limit. He didn't need to verbalize his concerns. We both understood that this operation was going to require not just tactical excellence, but also the kind of moral courage that separates true leaders from people who simply hold rank. The equipment preparation phase took most of the evening. We were configured for a light but highly effective operational load. Each team member carried advanced communication equipment capable of penetrating electronic interference, comprehensive medical supplies for treating injured civilians, portable water purification systems, high-energy food rations for distribution to evacuees, and sufficient ammunition to sustain prolonged contact with enemy forces. What made our equipment selection particularly challenging was the dual nature of our mission. We needed to be prepared for intense combat operations while simultaneously carrying humanitarian supplies and medical equipment. Every piece of gear had to serve multiple purposes, and every ounce of weight had to be justified in terms of mission effectiveness. But here's something most people don't understand about operations like this, and this insight will become crucial when you see how events unfold. The most important equipment we carried wasn't weapons or communication gear. It was trust. Trust in each other's capabilities, trust in our training, and trust in our collective ability to make split-second decisions that would determine whether families lived or died. What struck me most profoundly during those final preparation hours was the enormous weight of responsibility we all felt. This wasn't about capturing territory, eliminating enemy combatants, or achieving strategic military objectives. This was about preserving human life in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Every tactical decision we made over the next 48 hours would directly determine whether mothers saw their children again, whether elderly people survived to tell their stories, whether families remained intact or were separated forever. The night before the operation, sleep was elusive for most of us. I found myself thinking about my own family back home. My wife, Sarah, who had learned to manage her worry during my deployments, but never stopped caring. My daughter, Emma, who was just starting her sophomore year of college, and still sent me care packages filled with terrible jokes written on index cards. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to risk everything to help other families stay together, while my own family waited at home, hoping I would return safely. I spent those quiet hours going over contingency plans, alternative extraction routes, and emergency communication protocols. In operations of this complexity, you plan meticulously for every scenario you can imagine, then prepare mentally to improvise when reality inevitably differs from your expectations. The key to successful improvisation is having team members whose capabilities and judgment you trust completely, and I had exactly that kind of team. At 0400 hours, we received our final intelligence update, and the news was worse than we had hoped. The situation had deteriorated significantly overnight. Enemy forces had tightened their perimeter defense, increased patrol frequency around the civilian gathering points, and established additional observation posts covering potential approach routes. What had been classified as an extremely challenging mission was now bordering on tactically impossible. But here's what I learned over 25 years of military service. Impossible is just another way of saying that conventional approaches won't work. Sometimes the only way to accomplish the impossible is to think beyond conventional tactical doctrine and find creative solutions that your enemy won't anticipate. And in this case, we had something our enemy didn't expect. We were willing to risk everything for people we had never met. The helicopter flight to our insertion point was conducted in complete darkness, using terrain-following flight profiles to avoid radar detection. Each team member used those final minutes to run through individual responsibilities and contingency plans one last time. The landscape below us appeared peaceful in the pre-dawn darkness, but we all understood that in a few hours, that same terrain would become a battlefield where every shadow could conceal a sniper and every street corner could mark the end of our lives. As we approached the landing zone, I could see the besieged city in the distance, approximately 8 miles away. Even from that distance, the devastation was clearly visible. Multiple smoke columns rose from different sectors, creating a dark haze that obscured much of the urban area. Buildings showed obvious battle damage, with entire walls blown out and rooflines collapsed. Streets appeared to be blocked with rubble in systematic patterns that suggested deliberate destruction rather than random combat damage. The helicopter touched down in a clearing about 5 miles from the city's outer defensive perimeter. We had exactly 90 seconds to disembark with all our equipment and disappear into the surrounding tree line before the aircraft had to depart to avoid detection by enemy air defense systems. As the rotor wash settled and the sound of the helicopter faded into the distance, the silence was initially overwhelming, but it wasn't really silence. If you focused your hearing carefully, you could detect the distant sounds that told the story of what we were walking into. Occasional bursts of automatic weapons fire echoed from the direction of the city, the low rumble of heavy vehicles moving in tactical patterns. And underneath it all, something that made your blood run cold. You could actually hear the city itself, wounded and struggling like a living creature in pain. We moved out immediately in tactical formation, using available terrain features and vegetation to mask our approach. The first major obstacle was an enemy checkpoint approximately 2 miles ahead, an observation post that intelligence indicated was manned by at least 8 combatants with heavy weapons and direct communication links to the main defensive network. Successfully bypassing this position without alerting the entire enemy command structure would determine whether the rest of our mission was even theoretically possible. As we approached the checkpoint area, I signaled the team to halt and establish a hasty observation post. Through my binoculars, the enemy position was clearly visible, and what I saw made my heart sink. These weren't inexperienced militia fighters or poorly trained irregulars. The defensive positioning, weapon placement, and patrol patterns indicated we were facing professional soldiers who understood their business. Their fields of fire were perfectly coordinated to cover all logical approach routes to the city, and their communication discipline suggested a level of training that would make our mission exponentially more difficult. Master Sergeant Williams moved silently to my position and whispered, "Sergeant Major, there's something else you need to see." He handed me his high-powered scope and directed my attention toward the city itself. What I saw through that lens changed everything we thought we understood about this mission, and I knew in that moment that the next 48 hours would test not just our tactical skills, but our very souls. I could see women and children being moved in organized groups between buildings, always positioned where any direct assault would result in massive civilian casualties. This wasn't just a siege. It was a carefully orchestrated psychological warfare operation designed to paralyze any rescue attempt. I passed the scope to Sergeant Thompson, whose jaw tightened as he observed the same horrifying tactical picture. "Bloody hell," he whispered. "They've turned the entire city into a human shield operation. Every approach route is covered with civilian positions." The professional soldier in me had to admire the tactical effectiveness of what we were seeing, even as the human being in me was sickened by the callous disregard for innocent life. But here's what made this revelation even more disturbing, and you'll understand the full implications of this in just a few minutes. Intelligence had failed to identify this critical tactical element. We had prepared for urban combat, siege conditions, and hostile fire. We had not prepared for a scenario where every tactical decision could result in the deaths of the very people we were trying to save. Corporal Rodriguez studied the terrain between our position and the enemy checkpoint. "Sergeant Major," he said quietly, "there's a drainage system that runs parallel to their position. If we can access it about half a mile east, we might be able to bypass their observation zone entirely." Rodriguez had that ability to see tactical opportunities that others missed, but I could tell from his expression that even he was concerned about what we had observed. The drainage approach would add 2 hours to our timeline, but it was our best option for maintaining operational security. We needed to reach the civilian gathering points without alerting the enemy defensive network. Once they knew we were in the area, their ability to use civilians as shields would become even more effective. We moved out using available cover, maintaining tactical spacing and communication discipline. The terrain was more challenging than satellite imagery had indicated. 3 weeks of siege warfare had created additional obstacles, destroyed vehicles, improvised barriers, and scattered debris that forced us to constantly adjust our route. Every movement had to be carefully planned to avoid creating signatures that enemy observation posts could detect. As we approached the drainage access point, Lieutenant Hansen established communication with our command element. The radio traffic was minimal but crucial. Weather conditions were deteriorating, which would affect helicopter support availability during the extraction phase. We were also informed that diplomatic negotiations had completely broken down, meaning our 48-hour timeline was now absolutely firm. There would be no extensions, no additional support, and no backup plans. The drainage system was a nightmare of confined spaces, standing water, and complete darkness. We had to move single file through concrete tunnels that were barely large enough for a grown man with full equipment. The sound of our movement echoed despite our best efforts at noise discipline, and we had no way of knowing if the enemy had sensors or guards positioned along the tunnel system. After what felt like hours, but was actually only 45 minutes, we reached the exit point inside the city's outer perimeter. Rodriguez carefully removed the drainage grate and conducted a visual reconnaissance of the immediate area. What he saw made him freeze completely, and he quickly signaled for absolute silence. Through the grate, we could see an enemy patrol conducting a systematic search of the exact area we needed to traverse. 4 combatants with automatic weapons were methodically checking every building, every doorway, every potential hiding spot. They were professionals who understood counter-infiltration procedures, and they were being extremely thorough. We had 2 choices: wait for them to complete their search pattern and risk missing our timeline, or find an alternative route that might expose us to other enemy elements. I made the decision to wait. Sometimes patience is the most aggressive tactical choice you can make. We remained motionless in that drainage tunnel for 37 minutes, while the enemy patrol completed their search pattern and moved on to the next sector. The tension was incredible. 4 grown men in full combat gear trying to remain absolutely silent in a confined space while enemy soldiers searched for us just a few feet away. When the patrol finally moved on, we exited the drainage system and found ourselves in what had once been a residential neighborhood. The destruction was systematic and deliberate. Houses had been specifically targeted to create rubble barriers and limit movement options. Gardens and courtyards had been turned into fighting positions. It was immediately clear that the enemy had been using the 3-week siege period not just to starve out the civilians, but to engineer the urban environment to their tactical advantage. Our first objective was the school complex on the eastern side of the city, approximately 1 mile from our current position. According to our intelligence, this location housed approximately 150 civilians, primarily families with children. The school had been chosen as a gathering point because it had a large cafeteria, multiple classrooms that could provide shelter, and playground areas that could serve as helicopter landing zones if necessary. But as we approached the school district, it became clear that the intelligence picture was incomplete. The enemy had established observation posts in buildings surrounding the school, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach route. More importantly, they had positioned their own personnel in buildings adjacent to where the civilians were sheltering. Any attempt to assault these positions would result in a firefight in the immediate vicinity of the people we were trying to protect. Sergeant Thompson established an observation post in a damaged apartment building approximately 200 meters from the school. Through his scope, he could see civilians moving around inside the school courtyard, but he could also see enemy positions that had not been identified in our pre-mission intelligence. "Sergeant Major," he reported, "I count at least 12 enemy combatants in defensive positions around the target building. They've got clear lines of sight on all the civilians." This was the moment when our mission parameters fundamentally changed. We could no longer approach this as a conventional rescue operation. We were now conducting a hostage extraction in an urban environment where the hostage takers were using military tactics and had prepared defensive positions. Every decision we made had to account for the reality that wrong choices would result in civilian casualties. I gathered the team for a tactical reassessment. The original plan had called for establishing contact with civilian leadership, organizing evacuation groups, and conducting systematic extraction to predetermined helicopter landing zones. That plan was now completely invalid. We needed a new approach that accounted for the enemy's use of human shields and their superior knowledge of the urban terrain. Lieutenant Hansen suggested a psychological operations approach. If we could create diversions in other parts of the city, we might be able to draw enemy attention away from the civilian gathering points long enough to establish contact and begin evacuation procedures. It was a sound tactical concept, but it would require us to split our already small team, which violated every principle of special operations doctrine. But here's something I learned over my 25 years of service. Sometimes you have to break the rules to accomplish the mission. Sometimes conventional tactical doctrine doesn't provide solutions for unconventional problems. This was one of those situations where leadership meant making decisions that training manuals never prepared you for. Before I continue this story, I'm going to recommend a product that I've been using, and it's making a total difference in my life. You know, as you get older, you start noticing things. A bit of fatigue, lack of energy, and frankly, things weren't working like they used to in the bedroom. I wasn't getting those firm, long-lasting erections that I had when I was younger. I started using a product that completely changed my sexual life. It gave me back that confidence and performance I thought I had lost forever. I've left the link in the description of this video or in the first pinned comment. Now it's time to continue our story. We decided to implement a modified version of Hansen's suggestion. Williams and Rodriguez would create a diversion on the opposite side of the city, drawing enemy attention and hopefully some of their defensive assets away from the school complex. Thompson and Hansen would remain with me to establish contact with the civilians and begin preliminary evacuation procedures. The diversion plan was elegant in its simplicity. Williams and Rodriguez would use demolition charges to simulate an attack on one of the enemy's supply depots, creating the impression that a larger force was operating in that sector. The explosion would be significant enough to draw attention and response, but carefully positioned to avoid any civilian casualties. As Williams and Rodriguez moved out to establish their diversion, I felt the weight of command responsibility more heavily than I had in years. I was splitting my team in hostile territory, sending 2 of my best soldiers into extreme danger to create an opportunity that might not even work. Leadership in combat means making decisions with incomplete information and accepting responsibility for the consequences, regardless of the outcome. Thompson, Hansen, and I moved into position near the school complex. Through careful observation, we identified a section of the building where we could potentially establish contact with civilian leadership without alerting enemy observation posts. The plan was to signal our presence, establish communication, and begin organizing the civilians for evacuation. But as we prepared to make contact, something happened that none of our planning had anticipated. A child, probably no more than 8 years old, appeared at one of the school windows. She had obviously seen us moving through the rubble, and she was pointing in our direction. In that moment, I realized that our operational security was completely compromised. If we could see her, the enemy observation posts could see her, and they would know exactly where to look for us. The tactical situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. We had perhaps minutes before enemy forces would converge on our position. But we also had an opportunity: direct visual contact with the civilians we were trying to save. Sometimes in combat, you have to make decisions based on instinct rather than tactical doctrine, and my instinct told me that this moment of contact was our best chance to save these people. I made a decision that violated every principle of operational security I had ever learned. I stood up in full view of the school windows and used hand signals to communicate with the civilians inside. The risk was enormous. Enemy snipers could have taken me out instantly, and my actions could have compromised the entire mission. But sometimes leadership means accepting personal risk to accomplish the mission. The response from inside the school was immediate. Within seconds, we could see multiple faces at the windows, and someone was signaling back to us. A man appeared at the main entrance, cautiously opening the door and gesturing for us to approach. This was either our opportunity to establish communication and begin the evacuation, or we were walking into a trap that would end our mission before it really began. As we moved toward the school entrance, I could hear the distant sound of explosions from the opposite side of the city. Williams and Rodriguez had successfully executed their diversion, and I could only hope that it would buy us the time we needed to make contact with the civilians and assess their condition. But just as we reached the school entrance, everything went sideways in a way that none of our planning had anticipated, and you'll see in just a moment how one split-second decision changed the entire nature of our mission. Just as we reached the school entrance, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions around us. The enemy had been waiting for exactly this moment. They had used the civilians as bait to draw us into a kill zone. Rounds were impacting the concrete walls around the school entrance, sending fragments of masonry flying in every direction. The man who had been signaling to us dove back inside the building, and I could hear screaming from inside the school as the civilians realized they were caught in the middle of a firefight. This was the moment when everything we had trained for over decades of military service came into focus. We were pinned down in the open with minimal cover, facing professional soldiers who had prepared this ambush carefully. But more importantly, there were 150 innocent people inside that building who were depending on us to get them out alive. Thompson immediately identified the primary threat, a machine gun position on the second floor of a building about 100 meters to our north. The gunner had excellent fields of fire covering the entire school courtyard, and as long as that weapon was operational, no evacuation would be possible. "Sergeant Major!" Thompson shouted over the gunfire. "I can take that machine gun position, but I'll need covering fire, and about 90 seconds. Hansen was already working to establish communication with Williams and Rodriguez. We needed to coordinate our actions with their diversion operation, and we needed immediate information about enemy reinforcements that might be moving toward our position. The radio traffic was fragmented due to the urban environment and enemy jamming, but Hansen's expertise allowed him to maintain intermittent contact with both our team members and our command element. But here's what made this situation truly desperate, and this is the detail that will show you just how close we came to losing everything. The enemy wasn't just trying to eliminate us, they were deliberately positioning their fire to drive us away from the school without actually hitting the building itself. They wanted us to abandon the evacuation attempt and leave the civilians in place. This wasn't just combat, it was psychological warfare designed to break our will to continue the mission. I made a decision that went against every tactical principle I had ever learned. Instead of withdrawing to establish a more defensible position, we were going to assault directly into the enemy's prepared positions. Sometimes the most dangerous course of action is actually the safest one, because it's the one your enemy least expects. We were going to use their own tactical setup against them. The plan was audacious and probably suicidal. Thompson would move to eliminate the machine gun position, while Hansen and I provided covering fire and established communication with the civilians inside the school. Once Thompson neutralized the primary threat, we would have a narrow window to begin moving civilians out of the building before enemy reinforcements could establish new firing positions. But as Thompson began his movement toward the machine gun position, we received information that changed everything. Hansen had established contact with Williams and Rodriguez, and their report was both encouraging and terrifying. The diversion had worked better than we had hoped. They had drawn significant enemy forces away from the civilian areas, but they had also discovered something that our intelligence had completely missed. The enemy had rigged all 3 civilian gathering points with explosive charges. If they determined that they were losing control of the situation, they were prepared to detonate those charges and kill every civilian in the city, rather than allow them to be evacuated. We weren't just conducting a rescue operation anymore. We were in a race against time to prevent a mass execution. This information fundamentally changed our mission parameters. We couldn't just evacuate the civilians from the school. We had to locate and neutralize the explosive charges while simultaneously fighting off enemy forces and protecting the people we were trying to save. It was tactically impossible, which meant it was exactly the kind of mission that Special Operations Forces exist to accomplish. Thompson had reached a position where he could engage the machine gun. But before he could take the shot, something extraordinary happened. Civilians inside the school began throwing objects out of the windows at the enemy positions. Chairs, desks, books, anything they could find became improvised projectiles aimed at the soldiers who had been holding them captive for 3 weeks. It wasn't militarily effective, but it was the most courageous thing I had ever witnessed. The civilian resistance created exactly the distraction Thompson needed. His shot took out the machine gunner with surgical precision, and immediately the volume of enemy fire decreased significantly. Hansen and I moved to the school entrance, where we were met by a man who introduced himself as Dr. Ahmad Rashid, a physician who had been serving as the informal leader of the civilians trapped in the school. Dr. Rashid's English was excellent, and his information was invaluable. He confirmed the presence of explosive charges in the school's basement, but more importantly, he had been secretly documenting enemy positions and patrol patterns for 3 weeks. The man had essentially been conducting intelligence-gathering operations while pretending to be a helpless civilian. His information would prove crucial for the next phase of our mission. While Hansen established communication protocols with the civilian leadership, I had to make the most difficult decision of my military career. We had located the civilians and confirmed the presence of explosive charges, but we also had enemy reinforcements moving toward our position from multiple directions. We could probably evacuate some of the civilians, but attempting to save everyone would likely result in all of us being killed or captured. This is the moment that defines what military service really means. It's not about following orders or executing tactical procedures. It's about making impossible choices and living with the consequences. I looked at Dr. Rashid, then at Hansen and Thompson, and I knew that we were going to attempt something that had virtually no chance of success. We were going to save everyone. The plan required perfect coordination between all team members. precise timing, and more luck than any soldier has a right to expect. Williams and Rodriguez would continue their diversionary operations to keep enemy reinforcements occupied. Thompson would provide overwatch and eliminate threats as they emerged. Hansen would coordinate with civilian leadership to organize evacuation procedures, and I would go into the basement to locate and neutralize the explosive charges. Dr. Rashid led me to the basement access point, while Hansen began organizing the civilians into evacuation groups. The basement was a maze of storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and utility areas that had been converted into makeshift shelters. Finding explosive charges in that environment would be like looking for needles in a haystack, except these needles were designed to kill everyone in the building. But as I entered the basement with my flashlight and basic demolitions kit, I encountered something that stopped me cold. There were more civilians down there, families who had been hiding in the basement for the entire 3-week siege. Men, women, children, and elderly people who had been living in darkness, afraid to go upstairs because they believed the enemy would execute them if they were discovered. These people had been surviving on minimal food and water, with no medical care, no sanitation facilities, and no hope of rescue. When they saw me with my American uniform and equipment, the relief and gratitude in their eyes was overwhelming. But I also saw something else: absolute trust that I would find a way to save them. I located the explosive charges in a mechanical room that housed the school's electrical systems. The setup was sophisticated and designed to be tamper-resistant. Any attempt to disarm the charges incorrectly would result in immediate detonation. I had about 15 minutes of demolitions training in my entire military career, and now I was looking at a device that required the expertise of a professional bomb disposal technician. But here's what 25 years of military service teaches you. Sometimes you have to attempt things you're not qualified to do because the alternative is unacceptable. Sometimes courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. I began the delicate process of tracing the explosive device's wiring while simultaneously coordinating with Hansen via radio. The civilian evacuation was proceeding, but slowly. These people had been traumatized by 3 weeks of siege conditions, and many of them were physically weakened by malnutrition and dehydration. Moving them quickly enough to stay ahead of enemy reinforcements was proving extremely challenging. As I worked on the explosive device, I could hear gunfire from above as Thompson engaged enemy forces that were attempting to re-establish positions around the school. The sound of automatic weapons was getting closer, which meant our tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. We had perhaps 10 minutes before enemy reinforcements would arrive in sufficient numbers to overwhelm our small team. The explosive device was more complex than I had initially assessed. It wasn't just a simple bomb. It was part of a network of charges that were designed to detonate simultaneously at all 3 civilian gathering points. Disarming this device wouldn't just save the people in the school, it would prevent the mass execution of civilians throughout the city. But there was a problem. The device had a fail-safe mechanism that I couldn't identify. If I cut the wrong wire or disturbed the wrong component, it would send a signal to detonate all the other charges immediately. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. One mistake on my part would result in the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. What happened next will stay with me for the rest of my life. Dr. Rashid appeared in the basement, despite my explicit instructions for all civilians to remain upstairs during the evacuation. He looked at the explosive device and said, "Sergeant Major, I am not just a physician. Before the war, I was an electrical engineer. I helped design the power systems for this school. Let me help you." Working together, Dr. Rashid and I were able to identify the device's primary components and disable the fail-safe mechanism. His knowledge of the building's electrical systems, combined with my basic understanding of military explosive devices, created a partnership that neither of us could have accomplished alone. It was one of those moments when you realize that heroism comes from the most unexpected places. As we successfully disarmed the explosive device, Hansen's voice came over the radio with urgent information. Williams and Rodriguez had been successful beyond our wildest expectations. Their diversionary operation had not only drawn enemy forces away from the civilian areas, they had managed to locate and neutralize the explosive devices at both the hospital and the residential complex. The threat of mass execution had been eliminated. The civilian evacuation from the school was proceeding rapidly now. Dr. Rashid had organized the people into efficient groups, with healthy adults assisting those who needed medical attention. Children were being carried by older siblings, elderly people were being supported by younger family members, and everyone was moving with the quiet determination of people who knew this was their only chance for survival. Thompson's voice over the radio provided our tactical update. Enemy reinforcements were approaching our position, but they were disorganized and confused by the multiple diversions Williams and Rodriguez had created throughout the city. We had a narrow window of opportunity to complete the evacuation and reach our extraction point, but that window was closing rapidly. As the last civilians exited the school building, I took one final look at the basement where families had been hiding for 3 weeks. The conditions were horrible: no proper sanitation, minimal food storage, makeshift sleeping areas that barely provided shelter. But these people had survived through sheer determination and mutual support. They had maintained their humanity in circumstances that would have broken many others. The movement to our extraction point was the longest 2 miles of my military career. We were escorting 150 civilians through hostile urban terrain under sporadic enemy fire, with the knowledge that our helicopter support was limited and our timeline was absolute. But what struck me most during that movement was the discipline and courage of the people we were protecting. Parents carried children without complaint, despite their own exhaustion. Elderly people kept pace, despite obvious physical limitations. Young adults helped strangers as readily as they helped family members. Dr. Rashid moved throughout the group, providing medical assistance and encouragement with the same professionalism he had shown while helping me disarm the explosive device. When we reached the extraction point, Williams and Rodriguez were already there with the civilians they had evacuated from the hospital and residential complex. The sight of nearly 400 people gathered in that clearing, waiting for helicopters that might or might not be able to reach them, was both inspiring and terrifying. The helicopter extraction was a masterpiece of military coordination under impossible conditions. Our pilots flew multiple missions under enemy fire, landing in areas that barely qualified as landing zones, and loading civilians with the efficiency of experienced professionals who understood that lives depended on their performance. But here's what made that extraction truly remarkable, and this is the detail that still brings tears to my eyes. Not a single civilian was left behind. Not the elderly man who could barely walk. Not the pregnant woman who was obviously in distress. Not the children who were too frightened to understand what was happening. Every single person who had been trapped in that city for 3 weeks was safely evacuated. As our helicopter lifted off with the final group of evacuees, I looked down at the city we were leaving behind. The buildings were still damaged, the streets were still blocked with rubble, and smoke was still rising from multiple locations. But the city was no longer a prison for innocent people. The families below us were free, and they were alive. What I learned during Operation Last Chance changed my understanding of what military service really means. It's not about superior firepower or advanced technology or tactical superiority. It's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when innocent lives are at stake. It's about making impossible decisions and accepting responsibility for the consequences. Dr. Rashid and his family eventually resettled in the United States, where he continues to practice medicine and serve his community. Many of the other families we evacuated have also found new homes and rebuilt their lives, but they all carry with them the memory of those 3 weeks when they learned what human courage really looks like. Make sure to subscribe to this channel so you're notified when I post new videos about military operations. Hit that like button and leave a comment about what you thought of this story. And don't forget to check out the products I recommend. They're listed in the first pinned comment below. For me, Operation Last Chance represents everything I believe about military service. We don't fight to conquer territory or defeat enemies. We fight to protect people who cannot protect themselves. We serve so that families can stay together, so that children can grow up in safety, so that ordinary people can live ordinary lives without fear. 25 years of military service taught me many things, but Operation Last Chance taught me the most important lesson of all. True victory isn't measured in tactical objectives achieved or enemy forces defeated. True victory is measured in innocent lives saved and families reunited. It's measured in the quiet courage of a physician who risks his life to help disarm a bomb, and in the determination of parents who carry their children to safety despite their own exhaustion. That's the real meaning of military service, and that's why stories like this need to be told. Not to glorify war, but to honor the courage of ordinary people who do extraordinary things when everything is on the line. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video with another story from my 25 years of service.